Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Department of Dreams and the first day of the festival. The name of the session is called It Takes a Future to Fight a Future. Over the past 50 years, building strategies to meet possible futures has slowly shifted from being an activity of power elites to the planning tools of organizations and individuals. This evolution is now accelerating as we face massive challenges. Scott Smith and Susan Cox-Smith will talk about the need to make sure that futuring is a personal practice and how futuring at a human scale can help to equip us with alternatives to the ones we are already given by default. Scott is the founder and managing partner of Changeist, a futures research and consulting partnership established in 2007 and based in the Netherlands. You can find him on Changeist, and we'll make sure that we share his Twitter handle in the chat. And Susan is also a partner at Changeist, a writer, designer, creative director, interactive producer and researcher seeking to enrich public engagement with possible futures. You can find Susan on Twitter too. Hauspa, H-A-S-P-A, is Susan's Twitter handle. So I'm really delighted because I've been inspired by the work of Scott and Susan for many, many years. They've got a book out, which I'm sure they're going to tell you about. Lots of people we know love working with them in practical ways to think about futures. And so we're really delighted to be able to welcome them today on the first day of the Department of Dreams Festival. So I'm going to unmute you guys now and say hey, and I'll slowly go off the screen and enjoy the session.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Emmy. And we're like super happy to be here.
Absolutely.
What we want to sort of start with, I guess, is a little bit of a kind of provocation or some thoughts about, I guess, where we've been and where we could possibly go. And I'm going to do a quick kind of screen change. This phrase has kind of become something that it takes a future to fight a future. Is I guess it sounds a bit aggressive, but it feels like it's very much kind of a phrase for the moment. That I'll go into a little bit of kind of explanation about, but it's it's kind of central to an idea that's been important to us really for the entire time that we've been in practice, really for 15 years on our own practically, and another 5 years before that working with other kind of futurist groups. And it's I think it's an idea that we need empowering. A lot of people need kind of not even empowering anymore, or even capacity building, but they need to sort of understand that the time for taking control and being the authors and kind of architects of the futures that we desire we're really in the midst of it. Emmy mentioned that we've written a book. We have a book that's coming out in September, so end of the summer, through Kogan Page. In the UK, and so it's going to be out globally. But the book was called How to Future, and we really wrote it because we have been teaching in various contexts, either within kind of companies and organizations, or governments, NGOs, museums, and cultural organizations. We've been teaching groups of various sizes for the past decade how to access and apply the tools that we use in our own practice to basically for self-determination, for sort of self-authorship. How do they actually not just describe the futures that are preferable to them, but practically in an applied tactical fashion get there without having to immerse yourself in all of the kind of complexity of the sort of many technical tools that the foresight and futures fields provide. And for a long time, I've found James Baldwin to be inspiring, not just kind of in the present moment, but as a writer, as a thinker, and as someone who could actually kind of articulate and cut through to the core of the real issues that we have to sort of think honestly and confront ourselves honestly about. And this is actually a quote that's in the book, in the final chapter, where we sort of look forward and challenge people to apply these approaches to their own world. And Baldwin basically says, like, the time is now. The time is always now. We're always going to be working out and planning and charting and strategizing for a future that's down the road. But realistically, and I think we can really say right now, that future is something that is confronting us in the moment. We're in the middle of it. We're not just entering it. We are standing in the center of it and have a direct responsibility and need to find our own way out of it. We've become too accustomed to letting other people lead, other groups of people, other people with other levels of power or privilege or access in society or resources and tools do that leading. And so that's part of what we want to talk about briefly before we get into the rest of the session. Yeah, what does a steam engine have to do with the future? But I'm a history major by education, and always kind of interested to dig back into where we came from and where things have happened before. And some of you may know this story and some may not, but we didn't have time zones, for example, until the sort of creation of the steam train that had a sort of enough transcontinental rail, particularly in North America and other places where you could actually cross east to west in great distances at speed. We didn't have to invent the idea of time zones and kind of demarcations of time until we needed it as a kind of tool of convenience and organization to be able to use the things that we created. And that was, 1879, so 150 years ago. And, even the issue of kind of deep time wasn't articulated or sort of defined. We had always kind of accepted that, biblical time scales were the sort of default time measurement, that the earth was 6,000 years old or whatever the exact figure is. I'm probably going to get banished now, but it wasn't really until we started developing the modern approaches of geologic research that we needed to articulate geologic time and actually kind of understand going backwards that the earth wasn't necessarily 6,000 years old, that it's possibly 1.8 billion or 3 billion, depending on the time that it would take for these different, layers of sediment and different kind of, micro eras of geologic time to actually progress. Now, those are kind of historical curiosities, but it's probably not something that a lot of people really understand, if you haven't done any kind of research into it. But our modern concept of the future, yes, it's always been there as a kind of a concept in time that is either preordained by our kind of faith or is going to be a kind of temporal reality that we travel into. But the idea of the future as a thing with a big capital F was really an invention of the post-war period, of the types of power elites that I described in the kind of intro to the talk. That coming out of World War II and having had the experience of potentially, extinguishing humanity through the use of atomic weapons, and also seeing the collapse of the kind of the aristocratic era and the kind of the tail end of feudalism in different parts of the world, and the emergence of a kind of, a thing we could call the middle class or the masses society. Going back to Rob's previous talk, this idea that society actually, was something that if you didn't begin to plan for it, you couldn't accommodate it properly. You couldn't manage things like, and this is kind of the thinking of the people who were developing the tools at the time, you couldn't manage things like progress or manage things like, avoiding decline. You couldn't really ask questions about freedom and liberation or the understanding of control until you established and kind of demarcated this empty space in front of us in terms of time. And you can think about it on the edge of a town where, you take wilderness and you take the trees away and begin to see the sort of stakes and the ribbons that the chartered surveyors, lay out to demarcate where a new, shopping center, a new housing is going in. You think about it the same way, that the future is something that's kind of created with a dotted line out there to develop and to put plans into. So the more space we have, the more, if you're thinking about economic opportunity, by inventing the future, you effectively invent a place for things like interest to accrue or time to pass that can be monetized and financialized, but also creates a kind of zone of control for the development of things like science, technology, new forms of conflict and control, new forms of social policy, and also new aspirations, things like going to the moon or curing cancer or understanding DNA. And so in some ways, this kind of forward invented imaginary space of the future in the sort of modern sense has been the kind of, velvet roped area that has historically been the kind of development space of those in power, whether they're in commercial companies or in governments, or in other positions of power around the world, or privileged classes of people. And those tools, have been, they're taught in universities, they're handed down through corporate strategy departments, but until quite recently, they're not tools that have been basically accessible to the people who need them the most, the people who need the self-determination, the people who deserve the self-determination of deciding what goes in that space. And so the reason we wrote the book, and also effectively part of our practice, a large part of our practice, is to help unwind and kind of unbuild this idea that the tools belong to someone else. The ideas belong to someone else, that we're just stuck with imagination and not the ability to plan and to organize and to have access to the same kinds of critical analyses that are necessary to allow any of us as individuals, or as a small group of people, or a community to chart out, to uncover, to describe, to share, to debate, and then to understand the necessary steps that we need to take to access the futures that we want. And our publisher, if she's listening, might kind of wince. I mean, the book itself is, by description, written for quote unquote business leaders, but really secretly it's written for, two people who have an idea, who, want to mobilize on a certain issue in a community, two people who can come together over a cup of tea and make decisions, and imagine on their own, rather than that kind of idea being something for someone else. So it's about being able to, again, sort of return those tools and, to populations that can use them and can apply them and can, develop ideas and flesh out rich futures and create experiences, prototyping, developing scenarios and stories that engage other people, using group sense making and a kind of co-perception to understand different facets of different problems, and to be able to fill this, not a control space out there in that kind of artificially demarcated future, but to think of it as an opportunity space to create the types of things that we want and need. And so, kind of coming back to the origin of the title of the talk, if you don't like the future you've been given, the responsibility is on us to create our own. And us, can be any of us, and that creation can be anything that we want it to be. We used to talk about flat pack futures, basically, accepting the futures that other people develop and taking them off the shelf in the same way that we buy a lifestyle at IKEA. And this is more about being the ones who actually design the furniture and create the living space and develop the community and some of the things that Rob was talking about earlier, and doing it in a way that is inclusive, that brings the relevant voices to the table, do it in a way that is diverse and takes the opportunity to get a critical eye and a critical view and an expression of needs from many different types of people, many different types of organizations, an entire community, and not just the community leadership, for example. To do it in a way that's accessible, so that the tools themselves are, don't create a barrier to entry by being overly complex. Honestly, most of this kind of work boils down at the end of the day to different basic forms of critical questioning and critical thinking that is, within the capacity of everyone we've ever met and everyone we will meet. And to do so at a level of imagination that may be either pragmatic on one end of the scale, or completely exotic, visionary, fanciful, fantastical on the other. But having the opportunity to have a kind of a field or a canvas of debate to decide, which of those are not just, possible, but which of those are preferable for us. at any point in time. So, I guess in a kind of nutshell, the sort of takeaway message of this part of the talk really is this idea of, and Rob said this beautifully earlier, I think, it's like we can't get back to normal. Getting back to normal isn't desirable, isn't preferable. It's not an optimum state. We've seen what it does. And, by the same token, the idea of accelerating the future and bringing, the future with that capital F to being, at a kind of uncontrolled speed, all foreclose possibility. They sort of close down the cone of possibility. They deny the effort that it takes to actually get there, and just recycle the same future back to us all over again. And this is a great quote from Devin Powers in a piece that she wrote earlier this month, on pandemic futures on Medium. And it talks to exactly this kind of issue of that we're all wrestling with right now. How do we go forward in a new way and realize some of the things that we're already experiencing, like clean air, rebuilt communities, time with family, all of these sorts of things that we didn't have before, and yet also make progress at the same time. So, the bottom line to sort of take away is to think about, like, what do you specifically want from the future? What does you individually, your family, your friends, your community, your group or organization want to derive from the future? Like, where do you want to go? It's a simple question. And so in the book, we actually share a number of different sort of tools and methods that we've tried to strip away the complexity from, and, as I said, make accessible to the widest possible group, to ask some very basic questions, to use the intelligence we have. And one of those tools, actually, that's not in the book because of space, but we thought would be really useful today, is a technique called backcasting that some of you may be familiar with. But it's a kind of technique. Actually, I'll let Susan give you kind of the description of it. But it's something that could be really useful in trying to flesh out the many kind of reimaginings that we're trying to describe right now.
So we like to talk about backcasting as being one of the sort of practical tools that is available, that pretty much anyone can sit down with, a pencil and paper, or, something on their laptop, and really use their imagination to consider, what future vision do we want to aim towards? So in your work, in your communities, you probably already have some visionary ideas of what you would like to see in this future. So the way backcasting works is you start with your vision and a timeline, and then you work backwards to now to see if it's actually even possible to get to that vision in the timeline that you've set up. So if we want to talk about reimagining public safety in a community, a timeline that would seem, desirable would be right now, but of course it can't happen immediately. So let's look 5 years out to 2025. So there are a lot of things that have to happen between now and this new vision. Let's start to work backwards and do backcasting to sort of determine if this is possible in this time frame that we have. So one thing that will have to happen is that new community officers will have to be trained and deployed. There is a cascading list of questions that also come underneath that. But for now, we're going to do this in sort of Duplo blocks, moving backwards. And then we can discuss further, like, what questions you want to start to ask about each of these individual elements. So what comes before training and deploying these new officers? Well, you have to recruit new officers. So you have to make decisions about, do we have people in the community who will, meet the standards that we need? Do they have the educational requirements? Do they understand the goal of this public safety system that we want to try to implement? Is there funding? Is there community support? So coming before that, you actually have to develop the training criteria. You have to ask questions about, what are the things that we want in this new public safety system that will get us to this goal and make sure that everyone is a part and understands what that goal is. You also have to get funding, and that's one of the very first things that has to happen. And none of the rest of these things that lead towards the vision actually will get you there unless you have the funding to do that. And you have to co-create this new vision. It has to be inclusive. It has to be diverse. It has to be imaginative. All of those things that we discussed in the previous slide, you want to make sure that there is a cohesiveness to the understanding of what this new vision is. But the very first thing that has to happen right now, and we believe that this is happening, is that we have to demand change. So now you look at this list and you think to yourself, can we actually get there in 5 years? Is it possible for this to happen? Can we make the decisions, and can we then fund those decisions and move through all of these steps in the 5-year time period? It sounds like a long time when you first start thinking about it, when you want it to be right now, but it's really very, very difficult to actually meet all the demands of what this new vision will be.
Yeah, and one of the additional things too, this is a very, very simplified version of it that Susan's talked about. With each one of these steps, there are other questions that can be asked. Who do I need to work with to make this happen? Where do the resources sit, and how do we actually acquire them? Do we have, we talked about things like funding. Is there the funding to develop this new system? But do we even have the detailed enough descriptions of all of the different functions, like what does a mental health officer look like in the community? What does a family safety officer look like in the community? How do we maintain kind of anti-violence initiatives? What different kinds of community officers are there? All of those different things, as Susan said, are these kind of, cascading decision points. But I guess the key point is, not only asking yourself, are these things attainable in the time horizon that we imagined, but the process of working backwards rather than forwards is actually quite a bit more challenging in some ways than kind of shooting for a moonshot vision of eliminating all policing and having something else in its place tomorrow. These are necessities, but the need to have practical planning frameworks and ways of thinking about the concrete steps that need to be taken, the allies that need to be made, the networks that need to be developed, the resources that need to be gathered, the support that needs to be put in place underneath all of this, helps give us a sense of not just the challenge, but effectively a kind of set of marching orders, a list and a way of organizing ourselves so that we can tackle these problems in concrete ways and make them a reality, rather than just leaving them as purely a kind of issue for the imagination. So, again, you can pick your vision that goes on that sheet or on this kind of timeline, and that might be something in really grand scale, that we're going to Mars by 2030, or it might be something very small, but very critical, like we're going to make sure that everyone has access to clean water in our community, or that the school lunches are provided for everyone who could possibly be in need. Whatever that issue is, being able to work backwards and put up practical steps is a way of kind of bringing some structure and pragmatism to bear with the imagination that's so important. So one of the things we've done is, if you want to do this kind of exercise on your own, we've created just a kind of blank version of it. This is clearly something that you can sketch out on a blank piece of paper and a notepad that you've got with you, or hold your camera phone up and take a quick snap of the screen. But we'd really like to see your work here. We'd like to see your ideas of what those desirable visions are that are relevant to you and your context and your community. What that future time horizon looks like. Is it next year? Is it 5 years from now? Is it 50 years from now? And what are the all of the steps? And think about not just kind of technological steps or legal and political steps, but the economic issues, the social issues, the values issues. Do you have to change people's minds and behaviors to reach the vision that you want to reach? And note those going backwards from your kind of desirable goal and endpoint to the present. And we put a little hashtag HTF for how to future up there in the corner. If you do your own backcasting chart, if you would put that hashtag on it and share it with us on social media, we'll gather them all up together ourselves and Emmy and be able to sort of see where everybody's head's at in terms of the imagined futures that they want to achieve.
Amazing. Thank you so much for this, guys. I think so. There's lots of things we can talk about here. First and foremost, I want to say that I think it's a really great segue from the last talk as well, because as somebody who has often been thinking about this sort of grand plans, arguably my team today will say that I definitely didn't backcast enough to create a festival this big in 6 weeks, because I've been, working around the clock.
But it's here.
Yeah, but actually, what Rob was talking about, when you get past that initial moment of your imagination has seen something, it saw that possibility of that new public green, or it's suddenly brought into the consciousness the idea of something huge like abolition, or a car-free neighborhood, or schools completely transforming. You start to see it and you start to imagine it, and the excitement overwhelms you, and you might do lots of talking about it, and you might start to do some tests and experiments, and then the sexy, exciting part sort of dies out, and you're left with this huge vision.
Yeah.
And kind of like, how do we start to work backwards? So I think the tool is really fantastic in its simplicity of just visualizing where it is you want to get to. Because I think in a lot of our work, definitely experienced a lot of me never quite being ready for how many years something's actually going to take. Recently, or last couple of years, I always said that imagine everything takes 10, double the time that you imagine. And so I'm interested in some great examples that you have seen of people that you've worked with where they've potentially had a vision that they've put out into the world, or someone you've worked with, or you've watched them kind of go backwards, and also like some of the barriers that have come up. So let's talk about that a little bit more. And before you go into that, I was just going to say to everybody in the audience, if you're starting to just even scribble on a sheet of paper, it'd be really great to know the big and small visions that you are interested in pursuing, or whatever's in your heart. Just share them in the chat, and any questions. But for now, I'm interested in, tell us a bit about your work and some of the practical examples that you are inspired by, or even like ones that have gone disastrously wrong and what you see.
It's interesting. It's this seems like such a simple thing to do, but it does really kind of shine a light on this issue of like compression and feasibility and achievability. And as you've demonstrated, you can with a vision and enough kind of action and intelligence and support, you can brute force your way to things in short periods of time. History is full of that. You've achieved a fantastic festival in a really short period of time. But sometimes you see people wanting to go too fast. We particularly when you've got this kind of culture of acceleration, we've experienced this a lot. We've taught for the last 3.5, 4 years in Dubai and in the UAE, where you've got a place where, someone points their hand and a skyscraper seems to emerge overnight. It's practically like Sim City. And there's a kind of need for speed and an appetite for the immediate realization of things, in part because it's a cultural dynamic. There's a lot of reasons kind of driving it, but often it doesn't necessarily leave space for all of the interim steps that need to go in to make something happen. And so wanting to kind of make these tremendous leaps in very short periods of time, I think has become kind of almost over-valorized. I mean, we're stuck in this kind of spot between the need for immediate change. We don't have time to wait to remove carbon from the atmosphere. There's no time to wait for racial justice. There's no time to wait for this whole long list of issues, but we still have to figure out how to do it right to make it last, and to do it, in a way that brings the most people along. So we see organizations that are very good at kind of laying out the kind of breadcrumb trail and following it. We've worked, for example, in the past few years with International Red Cross and Red Crescent, and through a process of, we came in the middle of it, but the process of them, developing a strategic vision for the next 5 years that was going to both, speak operationally to how this huge global organization that does so much incredible good will work, but also anticipate the world that it's heading into. And doing both of those things at the same time is quite difficult. Even the backcasting doesn't sit in a vacuum. Yeah, sorry, thank you. That it's you have to be able to both anticipate or sort of understand what steps you need to get to your vision, but also see how the world is moving at the same time. You're trying to land on an aircraft carrier, the wind is blowing sideways. You're having a difficult time. So it's one of many tools that help you kind of bring those two elements together, but it can be challenging to go too fast or too slow.
Yeah. I think one of the beautiful things about backcasting is that, a further step, once you kind of know all the steps between now and your vision, is that you can also start to think about, well, if we don't get the funding that we think we need, how do we pivot, or how do we adapt or change? And so it kind of also helps to build contingency plans for as you move through this process and you start to go, or if things go much more slowly, can you push out, okay, now how long is it going to take us to get there? Are there things that we can shift or change? So we'd like to talk a lot about having the resilience to pivot in the face of unexpected events. And that's a big part of futuring that a lot of people don't, want to think about. What if the scenario turns bad, or what if, a pandemic happens? It's just, no one wants to bring that up in the meeting, but actually in futuring, that's the time to bring it up. And to make sure that there's some resilience in the plan that allows for pivots and changes when events make it necessary. One example I really like to give of kind of failed aspirational visions is the tendency for people to really want technology to address all of the problems. And AI is like, that's just the thing that AI will fix this, or AI will replace this, and when you start to ask people, okay, work us backwards from AI solves every problem to now, they just stop. They're like, I don't know. So it's kind of humorous, but also interesting.
Sad.
Yeah.
But also, not just tragic, but dangerous in some cases as well.
Yes.
When people don't fill in the middle of the story, that's the problem. Absolutely.
And I think it's really interesting about what is that balance between the space for imagination and emergence, and what is, like you said, a dangerous vision that is being, catapulted and invested in at speed. And I'm interested if we can stay on this topic about when the conditions change, because Daniel from our team, who's actually the head of design, has got a question that came up in a session we did prior to the festival, which was about reflection and understanding the things that block you from being able to dream and think about the future. And he talked in that a lot about this concept of psychological flexibility and what it means to be able to psychologically pivot. So I'm interested in some of that. What's some questions to you about what's the internal work that we need to do in order to be good futurists, but then also what do you do when the conditions change and it seems your visions, dreams of the future may be obsolete? What do you do with that? Is that, and how do you work with that? So I'm going to hold it on that question, and if you can go into that a little bit more, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah. So there's a couple of ways of going at that. To your sort of first question, when you say internal, it's actually, it is kind of it's so internal that it's inside your own head. It's sort of a psychological and kind of cognitive process where we are wired as biological entities, as creatures, neurologically, to be very poor at thinking about the long term, and very linear. We, for probably good reasons of survival, focus on getting to a resource, getting to safety, acquiring it, feeding yourself, getting to the next rotation of the sun. But we're not really good out of the box at thinking, being able to hold multiple possibilities, multiple contingencies in our mind at the same time. And actually, it's in the intro of the book. I write about this. There's a futurist named Jay Ogilvy who wrote an interesting paper about, I think 15 years ago, called Facing the Fold. And he talks about this idea of maintaining a scenaric stance. How do you keep your feet in two different possible realities at the same time, making one, operationalizing one? And I hate to kind of sound like a technocrat, but sort of, working to make one a reality while realizing the other is a possibility. And we tend to, for all kinds of reasons at all different scales, both as individuals and as groups, we foreclose one because it's just too difficult to focus on. But I really do believe, and we've seen this in so many people we work with, that a bit of training opens up that capacity. And I don't mean sort of necessarily like workshop training, but just kind of the idea of working with and kind of holding those multiple ideas in your head as possibilities without becoming frozen by it, without becoming paralyzed by those two different roads. Sometimes we talk about this colloquially as like walking and chewing gum at the same time, but it really is this always having kind of at least two possibilities in your head simultaneously. And over time, that gives you the ability to kind of feel for when to change feet, when to start shifting towards it. And practically everything we do, not just professionally, but personally, Changeist was set up in the US 13, 14 years ago. We brought it back to Europe 5 years ago, but we were planning for several years to make that transition, knowing that's where we wanted to head, but we always knew you might have to speed up, slow down, change plans, alter. But I think it becomes something that's ingrained. And so practice, and it helps us develop that mental agility, which then feeds to the second question of not being completely frozen or flat-footed when the one vision that you've invested in disappears. Having the kind of emotional resilience to recognize that was always a possibility, that it might not be attainable, and being able to hopefully have already been sort of pre-seeding and pre-thinking about another option so that you're able to sort of shift your balance. And Susan talked about, pivoting is sort of a term we pick up from, the tech world, right? That if this doesn't work, we'll pivot to that, Twitter was a podcasting app before it was a microblogging terror. That shouldn't be, again, the domain of technology companies and investors. So I think it just comes down to persistence and practice and kind of working on that mindset.
Well, and I think there's a reason that there's always more than one scenario, when we do client work, because what we kind of want to do is help our clients feel more comfortable with the idea of uncertainty, but kind of, boxing it in a little bit with all the different possibilities that are out there, so, all of which have some positives and some negatives. And it's not that we're saying it's this specific future, you're going to pick one and go with it. It's you want to determine what your most preferable future is, what you want to head towards, with the understanding that you've already had the opportunity to look at these other possible scenarios, and you have an ability to think about them if things start going in that direction rather than the direction that you planned for. So a lot of it is it's that scenaric stance. It's kind of maintaining an athletic posture of being able to shift or pivot and still be comfortable with the idea that, what's tomorrow is uncertain.
Absolutely. I'm endlessly fascinated by tools and frameworks and ideas of things like psychological flexibility and the generic stance that you talk about, because I come from like a sporting background, so I find those sorts of like analogies in game playing and game planning and all of that quite easy to work with. But also just really pragmatically, I just love more and more tools that I come across that help me do anything with everything that's in my head. So the backcasting one is a really great one for these times, because I think so many people will have had a glimpse or a glimmer, or over the next few days might have a glimmer of a future that they are really interested in trying to build or pursue. And so I'm really grateful for this. So I'm going to wrap up with three questions. Two of them come into one. So first of all, the two practical ones. So what do you do to support people who struggle to imagine bolder, because so much of imagination and creation is dictated by so many limitations, like you said, power, privilege, and self that internally disempowers your visioning? And that's come from Stephanie. And similarly to that, what sort of tools do you use to help people with this generic stance, or how do you work on that? So those are two practical ones, and then we've got one to wrap up the session.
Excellent questions, and I think it's following this kind of trajectory of accessibility, and
that's why we wrote the book.
Yeah, exactly. I think just, a lot of people haven't been given permission. The culture doesn't give a lot of people permission to have that kind of level of creativity that's inherent, and it used to surprise me. It doesn't anymore. I actually look forward to it, but it surprised me to walk into a workshop where there may be 2 or 3 people who have kind of commissioned it and they're really interested and they've read a lot of things about it, but there's going to inevitably be people around the kind of edge of the room who've never engaged in this kind of activity before, and simply giving people the pen and the question and starting not necessarily starting small, but starting near to them and asking a sort of different ways of sort of getting at some of the same issues around how they think about the future. What is their day going to be like? Finding different kind of doorways in to unlock people's ability to articulate that. We often have to like struggle to put a lid back on it, sort of, okay, we need to move on to the next thing. Everyone stopped writing because they've been writing novels. And, across cultures, I think I counted up the other day, I've sort of worked in about, 12 different languages and kind of national cultures beyond that. It's across the board. So I think people need to simply be, in some cases, given the opportunity and the prompt, something, at smaller scale, and then work their way up. Because saying like, have a vision of the future is a kind of intimidating thing. This is the whole point, because you realize now the steps that are going to be necessary for that. And so I think, finding those kind of simple prompts that kind of bring the future down to human scale for people, and ask them to start to describe it in ways that are really kind of near to them, and then building out from that builds that kind of confidence. And you're right, I try not to kind of throw out sports metaphors as but there's a reason people train for sport, right? There's a reason you train and you visualize. You're mentally going through hundreds of different scenarios, whether it's the person's going to pass you on the left with the bike on the turn, or it's, this person, she's going to pass the ball to you, or the keeper is going to be over there. This person plays close to the net. All of those things are essentially micro futures and scenarios that elite athletes are processing through all of the time. They don't have to play the exact match. They simply need to have thought through and kind of anticipate and broaden. You talk about it at the sort of athletic posture. It almost becomes a muscle memory and a kind of mental, cognitive muscle memory.
It's definitely an analogy that I can relate to a lot. I know there's a lot of different ways of thinking about this. A lot of people who do it in so many different ways, and over the next few days we've got lots of different things, from creative free writing to poetry to ways to a reflection session. So we're definitely going in from lots of different angles. The one I definitely don't see in this space, I don't see a lot in this space, and it's why personally, and I know it might not resonate with everyone, but personally, this talk is really like great for me because the way I think about this sort of stuff is very much around that, like, the practice, the training, the muscle memory, the getting ready for many possibilities to be true, for testing a scenario, imagining it in my head enough times that it might not be precisely how that happens, but it's exactly.
This is why, it's why we give people CPR training, so they don't just stare at the person who's collapsing or teach, Heimlich maneuver. It's why we do all of these small trainings. It's why we do drills. It's why why the fire department shows up when there's no fire. All of this is pre-rehearsal.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really fascinating around that practice and visualizing, and a lovely link from the last talk where Rob was talking about the fact that imagination thrives when there's some limits, and all of that. So and it sounded like you were about to say something, Susan, so should we come back to you?
Yeah, I was just about to say, like, a really, really simple exercise for people who kind of don't know where to wade in or how to get started is to just take kind of a future probability, something that we're always told it's going to be like this in the future, and begin to like tease out and question, why do we say that? Why do we think that? Why do we feel that? And then, again, it kind of feeds into that backcasting, like, who decided that that was where we were going to go? And it almost kind of gives you permission to start questioning those official futures that were kind of handed on a plate every single day, and to think about, well, who decided that that should be the future? What were they trying to sell me is a question that I ask a lot about, when I hear, oh, well, this person said that it's going to be like this, or we're going to go to the moon, or we're going to live on the moon, all of those things. So it's not necessarily that you're futuring yourself, but you are starting to question the actual uncertainties of why that future is out there.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much great stuff there. Thank you so much for sharing that. I as someone who is in that space of organising and trying to do something with so many things, I often find myself with a void of practical tools. So what I was going to ask to sort of wrap up the session, because I think that there's going to be so many doers and creators and people within this chat. Tell us quite practically a bit about the book, right? What can people expect? What sorts of things can they find in there? How can it support them to make those visions come to life?
I think one of the nice things about writing it you can find technical descriptions of tools and methods in a lot of places, but having the kind of lived experience of encountering so many different situations, topics, people, dynamics, cultures, all of these things, I feel like a lot of what we put into the book that people can expect is the kind of the voiceover, the sort of the narrator. Well, then they did this, and this is what the question, this is what question was asked or what objection. The practical, we sort of, Madeline Ashby, who co-wrote it with me, talks about practical, tactical kind of approaches. It's the stuff no one tells you. You can make it sound kind of glamorous and really interesting and sexy and scientific and everything else, but honestly, so much of it comes down to engaging with other people and dealing with them through a set of phases of first being more aware and open of the world and kind of becoming a good sensor, becoming someone who can take in and organize the things that we now deflect because we don't know what to do with them. So it's, the sensing element, different practical ways of sense making. How do you actually take the insights that you're gathering and the observations that you're making and the data you find and organize it in ways that you can begin to see connections and patterns? How do you then do the important part, which is turn that into a narrative? How do you make that a story that isn't just data? How do you make that a story that will engage other people? Because the scenario is useless unless you and I can debate its value. Is this what we want? Maybe what I want, probably not what you want. It's how do we negotiate? And the sense making and scenarios then kind of translate into the realization and prototyping. How do we actually generate something that kind of puts a handle on that future that someone else can pick up and engage with? So I think I would tend to sort of think of the approaches as being very practical, non-technical, not meant for people who have a background in this area. So, you don't have to have read up on it. We provide resources and links to other reading, but we don't kind of get bogged down in history. And hopefully it provides some kind of fuel for thinking and reflection and, kind of critique of your own world and your role in it. And people will come out of it feeling like they can go back to it, thumb through, find that section. And as we said at the beginning, having 2 or 3 colleagues and a cup of tea and some paper in front of you, that was the scale of the world we imagined this would be used in, not a massive boardroom or a huge agency somewhere. So hopefully people will find it accessible. We'd love to hear what people think about it. We're waiting for it in September. It got slowed down a little bit because of the COVID and the furloughs, but it's definitely on track, and we're waiting for Christmas for it to appear.
Amazing. I think it's so good because I just I feel at so many levels in education, in our communities, there's just some simple tools, some simple ways, a little book that you can throw into your rucksack as you're going about your business.
Yep.
My one of my team members, Daniel, does this a lot. He goes to like repositories of frameworks and says, look, there's a tool for this. We don't just have to try and figure it out ourselves. So I really love the idea of that. And I just want to say, as we start to wrap, there's some lovely comments in the chat around from people, including one that finishes off by Paul Howell, finishes off quite a long, lovely post he's written, saying creativity is the play of weaving them together. And I really like this because actually what I found through our work is the tools, the internal work and the tools and the visions are one part. And then as you start to figure out, weaving out together all these different things and other people and things that get in your way and different types of tools that you need to work with, and just the mixture of all of that is something that is then weaving these patterns together. And I wondered whether just to finish, you had any kind of questions about what or provocations to the audience about what we really need to do and think about as we come out of this time of incredible pain and trauma, but also hope and glimmers and a glimpse. What would you be your hopes? What would be your advice and hopes to people wanting to do something with their ideas now?
Yeah, we were talking about this earlier and kind of reflecting on the last few months and in particular the last few weeks, especially kind of looking back at your own country and seeing everything that's kind of going on. And we tend to talk about the future as a place where we put things, we build things. We have to make something. And I think, we kind of like backcasting, maybe we should flip this around and people should look at what's around them and think about what do they need to kind of take away to enable a better future? What piece of a system do they need to remove, or what whole system needs to be removed? I think that's very, very kind of topical at the moment. We're talking not just about building new things, but also unbuilding things. And not only is there need to be kind of permission to imagine, but we need sort of permission to unimagine or unrealize things. There's another tool called the 3 Horizons model that gets used in futures. And it basically, there's a kind of the things we do now that need to diminish and the things that we imagine that need to emerge. And that emergence part is something we focus on tremendously, and it's hard to do. But we have to take things away. And remove bits of systems and kind of delayer. So I think I would encourage people to kind of go the opposite direction for a moment and think about what needs to go, what needs to go away.
Oh, absolutely. So 2 things on that. I guess one of the things that really inspired putting this festival together now was at the beginning of the lockdown, Aaron Duffy-Roy wrote an article on the pandemic as a portal. And in that article, she talks very clearly about going through the portal in a way that's light, where you leave behind the things that you don't need to take with you. And that's certainly featured in some of the pre-reflection stuff that we've been doing. But it's also linked to another session we've got coming up in the festival with Cass Humphreys-Mass, who's part of a project with Cassie Robinson, who I know, which is talking about what you've just talked about, stewarding loss. In any other part of life, we would grieve when we lose something. And, what does that mean in unpacking and dismantling things, or grieving things that get lost because they didn't survive this time. I mean, I don't think I, want to grieve everything that we need to dismantle, but I definitely know people are holding on to things out of fear, and losing them needs to be a process. And another really lovely quote that we've just had in the chat is from Vicky Purwell. Hi, Vicky. I know Vicky. She said that parenting is another way for some of us to build some of these skills without thinking about it, because you have a dream, you get ready for being alive to many possibilities, and then being ready to pivot when it doesn't go to plan.
We wouldn't know anything about that.
Yeah, nor would I. But I hear that there's a lot of having to pivot in that.
It makes you. It can add a new dimension to working in futures. I can tell you that.
Absolutely. So on this note, what I want to do is just wrap up a little bit. And while I'm wrapping up, it'd be really great if you could share your screen again with the picture of the book, so that we can have that there, and then I'll invite you back in to say bye to everyone in a second. But I just want to say, on behalf of everyone at Civic Square, and I'm sure many of you in the audience, thank you so much for this. I'm sure many of you will agree that we're full of so many ideas, and in the first session of the day, people talked about so much of what we need to do in the future is already inside us. The ideas are there, but knowing what to do with our visions, how to organize, how to get through that phase where it becomes less exciting and you're in the trenches with your idea or your vision, and you're trying to figure out what's next or work with other people. So I personally really appreciate this, and I look forward to getting it. And to tell people a little bit more about what's going on before I hand back over to Scott and Susan to say bye. So you've had loads of talks this morning. They've been brilliant, and the flow has been wonderful. Really lovely open conversation this morning, a chance to talk projects and imaginations with Rob, and then come in with Scott and Susan, who've given us ways in which we can start to organise everything that might be going on in our heads. So we're really excited, and I'm sure Scott and Susan are too, to see what your visions are, what you're going to put on that piece of paper, and which bits you might be happy to share.
Thank you so much, Emmy. We've really enjoyed it. We enjoyed the challenge of kind of getting ready for it. It's a lovely event in the way that it's kind of coming together on the fly, but also has a bit of kind of friendliness to it. I think it's a really, really important time to be bringing everybody together around many of these ideas. So, we've been happy to participate, and anybody who wants to get in touch, you know where to find us. We're happy to kind of answer questions, and if you do pick up the book, give us your feedback. We'd love to know what you think. What's works and what's missing.
This has been so brilliant, and thank you, Emmy, for bringing us in. It's just been so much fun, and these are the people that we want to be talking to about future. So it's a win-win all the way around. So again, thank you.